Hello again. So here we are, December 13th, part two of this series focusing on relevant revelation. In case you missed last week, you can see that video, or if you missed December 13th, here we are. So I do have a series of questions that I want to ask and challenge you because I'm recording this after the lesson this morning. We're not hearing from the group, sadly. So I hope that you can follow along and maybe try to answer some of these questions on your own. Pause the video if you need to. We are going to, again, go to the PowerPoint here. And if I go to full screen mode, you'll lose my little video in the corner. So I don't want to do that. So I apologize for now that the screen is small. I hope you're seeing this on a large enough device that you can read it. But again, here we go. Relevant revelation. We are understanding the Bible as one continuous story. Last week we talked about the basically the structure of my book, Relevant Revelation, and how it is following the 7 stages of humankind's development. For example, if you look at the screen here, all the capitalized words are the stages of human development: conception, birth, infancy, childhood, adulthood, death, and heaven. And we talked about that last week to give you the context. Just so you know, here, we're talking about the history of Israel as if Israel is a human being. And you know that from reading the Old Testament, sometimes Israel is treated as a human being. She has the name, she's the name of the nation, but she is often considered like an individual, and like Jacob was and renamed Israel, so he's an individual. But even later on, as the nation of Israel is treated as in Israel sins, Israel asks forgiveness, Israel needs to repent, etc. So we get this sense that Israel is a human being. That symbolism is there in the Bible. We also talked about last week layering of stories, picking up on themes that are being used again and again, and how that can help you connect stories, events, and people, and better appreciate the meanings of those stories, events, and people, and the themes that are being used in the Bible. So that brings us to today. We are looking at 3 of the 7 themes that are in this book because they're so closely related. Barren women, the children those barren women have they are brothers. And so then we see often over and over again that the younger brother is favored by God. Man favors the older, but God favors the younger. And then that can lead to jealousy among the brothers and conflict. And you can see there, lesson 6 is the change of heart theme. We'll talk on a little bit today as well. So those are the 3 themes we're focusing on today. In Genesis, we had 3 barren women. You're familiar with these stories. The barren women are in red. They all give birth when they are healed by God to powerful men used in the story of Israel's history: Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and arguably Benjamin. And it's interesting here, you can see that we have the brothers theme happening because Sarah gives birth to Isaac, but he's the second born. Ishmael is the older. And so last week we saw those as brothers in conflict in Genesis. Esau and Jacob, of course, have quite a conflict that is resolved toward the end of the story. Joseph has a conflict with all of his older brothers, puts them through a test, and in the end, they pass the test, and there is a beautiful reconciliation that is the end of Genesis. Here, you're going to see a list of all of the barren women in the Old Testament. So notice them. I have numbered them for you, 1 through 7. These are the barren women in the Old Testament. This is a beautiful example of a reoccurring theme that when you pay attention to it and ask, why is it here? It will unlock so much meaning. and so much appreciation for what God is doing. So, for example, these barren women here in red, you'll notice that 1, 2, 3 are in Genesis. 4, the woman is not named, but the special child is Samson. 5, I hope you remember Hannah's story where she prays and prays and prays for a son and tells God that if he gives her one, she will give him to the priesthood, and that is Samuel. Then notice that number 6, Michal, is not healed. 7, we don't have her name, and she has a husband, we don't have his name, and they have a child, and we don't know their name because Elisha intervenes. So let me remind you a little bit about that story in just a minute. Let's focus on 6 for now. Let's go in order here. 1 through 5 are miraculous births because God heals barren women. Number 6 is Michal. She is the only one that is not healed. And if you go to 2 Samuel 6:16, the Bible explicitly tells us why she's not healed. That God basically doesn't heal her because she shows contempt for David when he praises God with dancing, and he's so free in the spirit that she looks at him with contempt. Remember, Michal is actually the princess, the daughter of Saul. So she presumably has a sense of what kingly behavior should be, and David is not exhibiting it. And she, looking through the window down at David, even though the author tells us that she loves David, she was in love with David when they married. Here she has contempt for him because he is freely worshiping God. And so that's why she's not healed of her barrenness. I would also say that it's kind of helpful to consider what would happen if she did have a child, because she is the daughter of Saul. And it's important in the story that we understand that Saul's kingdom comes to an end, and that David is not related to Saul except by this marriage, but he's not heir to the throne. If David and Michal were to have a child, that child would be Saul's grandson. And that apparently was not part of God's plan. We know that it's actually Solomon who is chosen and favored by God to be the next king. And you also see the symbolism set up from Genesis 1, because there's 7 days of creation. 7 is the perfect and complete number. 6 is the 6th day, the day that man was created. So 6 becomes the number of man, and 7 becomes the number of God. And so it's interesting that the 6th barren woman does not get healed. And when I say 6th, these are chronological, of course, in the Bible. And then 7. Let's talk about that for a minute. If 7 is the perfect godly number, let's look at the 7th barren woman in the Bible for a minute. She is a Shunammite woman. Her husband and she finally have a son. The Shunammite woman is generous. She takes care of Elisha. She is hospitable to Elisha, makes sure he has a place to stay when he comes to town as a prophet. And so she, being Shunammite, notice, she's outside the Israelite faith. She shows a faith that is great and pleasing to God. And so the people around her are talking to Elisha, and Elijah says, how can I repay her generosity? And the people say, well, she is without a child. So Elisha prays to God on her behalf, and she becomes pregnant with a child. The child grows up to some extent. We don't know how old the child is, but eventually the child is ill and dying and dies. And the Shunammite woman's response tells us a lot about her. She has such faith that she goes to Elijah for assistance, for help. And Elisha then returns to her, goes to the dead child, lays on that child, and brings that child back to life. Oh my gosh, this is why this is such an awesome book. There is very, very little in the Old Testament about resurrection, but there's this story. And this story is not the first time we've heard of a barren woman. It's not the second time. It's not the third time. It's the seventh barren woman who is being rewarded for her faith in God. And she has such faith that she believes that Elijah can assist her after her son's death. And he does. God shows up and rewards that faith with the greatest miracle, you could argue, in the Old Testament. A child is brought back to life. Brought back to life. And yes, it is a foreshadowing of what is to come. So those 7, 1 through 7, are all in the Old Testament. Then look what happens in the New Testament. The New Testament opens in Luke chapter 1 with Elizabeth, Mary's cousin. She is barren. Elizabeth, in Luke 1, we're told she is barren. And God blesses her and her husband with a baby, and that baby, we're told, has the spirit of Elijah. That is John the Baptist. So we have this theme of barren women, and these barren women often, especially in the first 3, have multiple children, not just one, but multiple children, and the younger is favored by God. We see a little bit of that here, and we'll talk more about that later. But for right now, Elizabeth has a child that is older than her cousin Mary's child. Mary's not barren, but she conceives miraculously and gives birth to Jesus Christ. So keep that in mind. I don't think it's a coincidence that there are 7 barren women of the Old Testament, and I don't think it's a coincidence that there are 7 barren women in the Bible who are healed. And I don't think it's there for no reason. It is building up to a miraculous birth of a virgin. Of a virgin. Now, why would she be a virgin? Well, she can't be barren. The only way they would know that she was barren is if she were having sex with her husband, right? They didn't have fertility clinics back then, right? So she is a virgin. God had a plan that he was building up to and to the Christ. And that is exciting to me to consider, because a great deal, we don't know exactly, but a great deal of the Bible was written before the exile. Apparently, a great deal of the Bible was compiled during the exile or after the exile. How could they have known? I don't know, but God knew. And for these things to be building and building and building up over time, and to shine the light on the focus and the goal and the culmination of Jesus Christ as the miraculous birth. It's amazing. It's brilliant. I love, love, love it. Okay, more later. We're going to move on here. Let's look at the younger brother as favored by God. We had Cain and we had Abel. Abel's offering was favored. Some people say they know why that is. I think the story is a little more gray than some people see it. Well, they say, well, Abel was favored because he brought the first. He brought the firstborn. He brought the choice lamb, right? For whatever reason, Abel's is favored, but it causes trouble, conflict between Cain and Abel, right? Isaac is favored. Obviously, that brings about jealousy with Ishmael. Just like Cain was jealous of Abel, Ishmael is jealous of Isaac. And of course, Jacob and Esau's story, we know that as well, that Jacob is the favored one by God. Notice that man favors the eldest. It's the firstborn. We really get this clear in the Jacob and Esau story, but it's the firstborn that gets the birthright. It's the firstborn that gets the blessing. That's the culture of mankind. But God is interested in turning these things upside down. God wants to do it his way, which is not our way. And so God is favoring the younger child over and over and over again. You see this also in the 12 brothers. It's interesting that in the 12 brothers, the favored son is a little trickier, but we do see that Joseph is favored. He's gifted by God with dream interpretation. He goes from the pit to the palace. We see that God is with Joseph. We're told God is with Joseph. So Joseph is the favored brother. He is the firstborn, even though he is the 11th born of Jacob's sons. So he is the youngest at one point. Then God blesses Rachel with a second son that's Benjamin. And Benjamin gets his blessing too, because you may remember the first king of Israel is a Benjamite. So, in a sense, there's a double favoring. In fact, that's another theme in the Joseph story because we have Ephraim and Manasseh. That's a double favoring as well. But at any rate, he gets a double portion. Joseph gets a double portion in the tribal sectioning of the promised land. That's what I'm referring to with Ephraim and Manasseh. But with you got to know these stories; they're so great. But anyway, with Joseph and with Benjamin, you have a blessing of Joseph as the youngest or a younger brother, and then you also have Benjamin getting a blessing as well, being the tribe that produces the first king of Israel, and then Manasseh and Ephraim. Reread it; it's so great. The last chapter of Genesis specifically shows Jacob blessing Ephraim over Manasseh. And Joseph is their father. He's like, no, dad. No, dad. Manasseh's the oldest. And Jacob says, no, I'm blessing Ephraim. So you know that it's not just your imagination or my imagination. God is favoring the youngest over and over again. Of course, the question is why? Right? We'll get there. The theme of the younger brother is favored goes on past Genesis, and these are just a few major examples. We see it with Miriam, Aaron, and Moses. Moses is clearly called by God and favored by God. And this is a good example to say what favoring means. When I teach this to my middle schoolers, I have to take a little pause and say, favoring a child looks different with God than it does with man. When Jacob favored Joseph, he foolishly gave him an ornamented robe, right? A coat of many colors. And it caused jealousy among the brothers, understandably so. But when God favors someone, there's more to it than just spoiling or blessing or showing generosity or giving a blessing. He is interested in that person being used by him, being equipped by God, and being used by God for God's will. So, in effect, if you're favored by God, your life is not so much your own. It becomes an instrument of God's will. There's a great deal of sacrifice when you're favored by God. I wouldn't want to change places with any of these guys in red, especially Abel. No, seriously, I wouldn't want to change places with any of these guys in red. They had hard lives. They had very, very difficult choices, and they were held to an extremely high level of accountability. For example, Moses, I think when you read it, you think, what do you mean he doesn't get to go to the promised land just because he got angry? But he doesn't get to go to the promised land because he got angry and he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. That's what we hear in Numbers. So it's a high level of accountability. Being favored by God means being used by God. And it also means that whatever your weaknesses, flaws, or sins are, they will be remembered forever too. Yeah. That's a nice place to continue. What does this mean? Why do we care? So what? It's a reoccurring theme, Dana. Why do we care that God favors the younger? What does it mean to us? Well, I want to understand this theme. I want to wonder, why is it developing over time? And what is it going toward? If it continues with David as it does, David and his brothers are the sons of Jesse, and David is the youngest. If it continues even with David and with Solomon, then it's leading up to something. And how does Christ fit into this? So I had to ask myself, who are brothers to Christ? I had to ask myself, who are sons of God? Because Jesus is the Son of God. So to find out who his siblings are, I need to find out who is the Son of God and who are the children of God. And when I look for that answer, I find Adam and Israel. Those are the children of God. So sons without earthly fathers. Jesus doesn't have a father. Who else doesn't have an earthly father? Adam. So Adam then becomes the continuation of this theme, the culmination of this theme. And I would even go so far as to say the purpose of this recurring theme is that Adam is, and remember his name means mankind, right? So Adam is a child of God, but Jesus Christ is the favored child of God. And remember, favor doesn't mean favorite necessarily, it means equipped to do God's will. Remember another part of this recurring theme of favoritism, I shouldn't say favoritism, being favored by God, had to do with the fact that there was jealousy and conflict. Well, you see the conflict here between man and Christ, right? That there's a conflict with man, and Christ is the one who's going to be used as an instrument of reconciliation, restoration, and forgiveness when it comes to man. Okay, let's keep going. Brothers in conflict theme. Obviously, I've already leaped towards it. I can't help it. It's what naturally comes next when we talk about the favoring of the brothers. Brothers in conflict theme in Genesis. We talked a little bit about this last week, but here they are again. You can pause here and read this carefully if you like. The brothers in conflict theme continues through the Old Testament. Again, we have Miriam, Aaron, and Moses as the first set that I'm going to talk about right outside of Genesis. Do you remember their conflict? Do you remember what we were told in Numbers 12? Numbers 12. There is a conflict between these three. Miriam and Aaron are speaking against Moses. They're actually talking about his worthiness of being chosen or called. God doesn't like it. God strikes Miriam with leprosy. Do you remember how she was healed? She was healed because Moses prayed for her. Moses prayed for her. The offended restored and forgave her. And then God healed her. How's that for a development of theme? We had brothers in conflict throughout Genesis. Genesis ends with this beautiful 12 brothers coming together, embracing, hugging, and kissing and loving one another. And Joseph steps up in this incredibly mature, spiritually mature statement of what you meant for harm, God meant for good. He doesn't harbor resentment. He doesn't harbor bitterness towards his brothers. He gives it to God. So when we have the very next story is about Moses, when we have Miriam, Aaron, and Moses having a sibling conflict, it's fascinating how that is resolved. Moses himself prays for Miriam, and God hears that prayer. And of course, again, we don't have to find out how Miriam felt afterwards. We know how she felt afterwards. Of course she was sorry. Of course she learned. And she is given, and is Aaron. Miriam is a prophetess. Aaron is the first high priest of Israel. You have a restoration, not just with Moses, but with God. Beautiful. Love it. Okay, so David and his brothers. This story may not be as familiar to you, so I'm going to have to pop back to young, I don't know if he's young or not, I guess he's young, a young man named Eliab. And this is in Samuel. So if you want to turn to 1 Samuel 17, this is around the David and Goliath story, and we get a little picture into the brothers of David in this section, and I'm just going to read a tiny bit, well, I guess a verse or two. Again, it's 1 Samuel 17:28. And David has just come on the scene. He's getting ready to ask about who is this Goliath, who is this this person who's trying to stand up against the Lord Almighty's people. 20, that's my paraphrase. 28. When Eliab, David's older brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger and asked him, Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. Clearly, Eliab has some issues with David. The very next verse, 29, now what have I done? Is David's response. We know this. We know this story. We live this story. This what's so beautiful and universal about these relationships in the Bible that we can relate to. David's response, now what have I done? Can't I even speak? It tells us in literally 2 verses all we need to know about Eliab and David. Eliab's the oldest, David is the youngest, and Eliab is either jealous, but he's certainly antagonistic towards his brother David. So we have the brothers in conflict theme continue there as well. But one of the beautiful things we have also is a counter example. We have a counter theme here with David and Jonathan, because they're not brothers, but they love each other. Their love for one another is stronger than brothers. And just to make it even more fascinating is that technically within the story, they turn out to be brothers. They actually become brothers-in-law in the story because David marries Michal. Michal is the princess of Saul and Jonathan is the prince of Saul. So they're brother and sister. So through the course of the story, we see that David and Jonathan, who should be enemies because they're both in line for the throne. David is going to be the new king of Israel because of God's anointing, and Jonathan is in line for the throne because it's a son of Saul, the first king of Israel. So they should be enemies. But amazingly and beautifully, they love one another. And I say that because nowhere else in the Bible, I should say nowhere else in the Old Testament, is there an expression of love like between these two friends of Jonathan and David. And I think that's because it is part of the culmination of the brothers in conflict theme. These are the ultimate example of what brotherly love should be. Jonathan says, the Bible tells us that Jonathan loves David more than a brother, more than himself. And you know that's true because Jonathan puts his life on the line by siding with David over his own father, who's king. It's beautiful. It is beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah. I am struggling with whether to go on or not, but I'm going to go on a little bit. Maybe we'll have time to get back there. And, of course, David, moving forward in the story after Jonathan dies, by the way, giving his life for David. That's true friendship. That's true brotherly love. When David is on the throne and he commits his sins of adultery and lying and murder, the response, the consequence for those sins is that God curses him in the sense that he says, the sword will never depart from your household. And so as we look at the sons of David, which is the last line here, Solomon and his brothers, we know Solomon in the story is favored, but because of David's sins, the consequence from God is that the sword will never depart from his household. And we know, I don't want to get too deep into this, but that Amnon is the oldest son of David. The next is Absalom, and no, the third son is Absalom, and the fourth is Adonijah, and all of them end up dying by the sword, and it's a whole bunch of mess. It's a whole bunch of sinful mess that unfortunately they probably learned by watching their father, which is another theme that I don't cover, but there's many obviously in the Bible of destined to repeat the sins of your own parents. But Amnon wants Tamar, and Tamar's his half sister, the full sister of Absalom. And so Amnon rapes Tamar, and Absalom is obviously protective of his sister and upset with him, and he waits a couple of years. But at the first opportunity he has, he kills Amnon. And Adonijah is killed for trying to take the throne after David's death. So there's a great deal of murder, death, conflict in the brothers that are sons of David as well. That's as far as I'm going to go right now. We do have some more discussion questions, and we've covered many of them already. Let's look at the brothers' stories again. All the brothers' stories have conflict. What determines whether there is reconciliation or not? I don't know if I've covered this as well as I would if we had more time, but generally speaking, what determines if there's reconciliation? A change of heart. If one brother is willing to forgive the other, that's helpful. If the one who is the offended, the offender, if he has a change of heart and asks forgiveness, there's reconciliation. So that is a recurring theme that develops over time. And as I say, the David and Jonathan story is a beautiful example of what brothers in conflict should be. And that is, David and Jonathan, for all intents and purposes, they should hate one another. They should be mortal enemies, but yet they don't. They love one another because they see the good in each other. Number 2, Exodus has an elaborate call narrative for Moses. How is Moses called by God? Is he eager, hesitant, prepared, equipped, worthy, or favored? He is hesitant, appropriately humble, and he is also favored by God. And what does that favoring mean? In the rest of this question here, it means that he's equipped to be used by God. So number 3, who is your brother? Can a friend be closer than a brother? And can you think of a biblical example of this? I hope so. A friend can be closer than a brother. We talked about this in class, and Ashley Hightower said, David and Jonathan. And of course, that's the example I like to pull from as well. The other questions that we talked about in this lesson: list all the barren women in the Bible so far. That's on another slide. And why do you think God chose to heal them? And what was the result? God chose to heal these 7 barren women, and all of them produces, this is another bigger issue, but they all produce types for Christ. I don't have time to get into all that, but they all produce powerful men of God that are used in the history of Israel. How do the following themes play out in David's story? This is one of the reasons why I love David's story, and it's such an epic, is that it covers all of the themes. It covers brothers in conflict, the younger brothers favored, the change of heart theme, the low raised high, the barren women, and the covenant. They're all in David's story. Beautiful stuff. And then I ended my series of questions with this: is there any hope for Israel, and where can it be found? So I wanted to again, here's the barren women, where it culminates in Mary's miraculous birth, where she gives birth to Jesus Christ. And then the younger brother being favored by God culminates with Adam, Israel, and Christ. This is where all of today's lesson is leading. This is the culmination. Okay. In the Old Testament, there's Adam as the son of God, the firstborn of God, so to speak. And then there's Israel. And Israel is favored. Israel is favored among mankind. Of course, you remember Adam means mankind, right? So Israel is the favored son throughout the Old Testament over mankind in general, right? And then we find that Israel falls away. They don't listen to God. They don't listen to the prophets. They are unfaithful to God by following and worshiping other gods. And so there's a consequence to that. They fall away. But there's still a remnant in Judah at the end of the Old Testament. And their hope is in the coming Messiah. And then Christ comes. And Christ is you could argue, I'm trying to set it up this way, the third child, so to speak, of God. And now we had mankind and Israel, where Israel was favored. Now we have mankind, Israel, and Jesus. And Jesus is opening up the favoring to all, even the older child, all of mankind, all of humankind. It's beautiful. Jesus is the favored son, in a sense. in the sense that Jesus is being equipped to be the Redeemer, the Savior, the vehicle through which God is going to redeem and extend salvation to all of his children on earth. So you may remember the last question from 2 slides ago. Is there any hope for Israel? Absolutely. Imagine Israel in 722. Assyria comes, conquers their land, oppresses their people. In 586, Babylon and the Babylonians destroy the temple. Israel's hope is in restoring that temple. Israel's hope is that the Messiah will come and be restored on the throne of David. And Israel's hope is that God's favor will be restored on them. That's where Israel's hope is. But the Messiah, they didn't necessarily recognize, because the Messiah was interested in redeeming and saving them through his resurrection and giving them the power of the Holy Spirit. It was a spiritual restoration, not a physical on this earth restoration. And ultimately, the sons were restored to the Father. The sons, Israel and mankind, are restored to the Father through Christ. And this is beautifully portrayed. I'm just going to give one example because of time, but this is beautifully portrayed in Jesus's parable of the prodigal son. In that story, you remember, there are 2 sons. There is the older son who does everything right, follows the rules, obedient to his father, does what's expected of him. And then there's the younger son who goes out and does what he wants to do. And he follows his way, his own way, until he's sorry and repents and humbled. He returns to the Father, and the Father throws a feast for him. And he is restored to his Father. The older son is angry, frustrated, and jealous, following the theme that has been building up the entire Old Testament. And the Father speaks, and he says, he was lost, and now he is found. I am celebrating this because I am restored with my son, whom I love, and whom you love, and I love you too. And that's all part of the story. But it is not the first time we've heard this story. We have heard it again and again and again. It's brilliant. There's so much. There's so much to talk about, and I love to talk about it. And I just need more time to do so. But this is how I'm going to end our time. Recurring themes show emphasis. Repetition by the author shows significance in writing, right? If they're going to say it again and again. And this is true of any good work or any good novel. If there's a red bird that comes and sits on a fence in chapter 1, and then a red bird appears again in chapter 2, and then a cardinal sings in chapter 3, you know the author is connecting those events. You know the author has something to say, and you know that they are purposefully using that for symbol. So it is an old traditional literary technique, and it is used in the Bible. Consider the development in these reoccurring themes. How are they different every time they're mentioned? What is different every time they're mentioned? If they show a continuing growth over time, that's purposeful. The author is leading to something, growing to something, building to something. And it's purposeful, and it's astonishing considering it's more than one author over thousands of years. But it points to a unified story, and it points to one author and is God. It's amazing to me. I think about just what's on the screen right now, that tradition says that Moses wrote the first 5 bullets here, and then Samuel wrote the David story, and presumably scribes wrote Solomon's story, maybe. But you get the idea. And then, of course, the New Testament has completely different authors at a different time that during the exile they never could have imagined. So how amazing is it is that there is a continuous story going on, what seems to be above the heads of the author themselves. They're not aware of it. Or if they are, it's brilliant. Either way, it points to a divine intervention. His story points to, culminates in, and delivers to us the Christ. So that is where I'm going to end today. I hope you found this to be helpful, and I hope that these videos help you if you miss Sunday school. And I hope you have a great day and a very Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.